am Tejas Oza, and I will be talking about how I approach game balance and systems design. Just so you know who I am and the things I've worked on, I've worked at 3 companies prior to where I am right now, which is a little indie. My first company was Blue Giant, where I worked on an RTS called Trist. Then I worked at YesGnome, and then I worked at Kryptonite Games, which is a part of Glue, where I worked on a whole bunch of live ops titles that are predominantly shooters. So another primer before we begin, if you go to Google and just search for like game system design, you're going to get like a very squarish explanation, which is systems design is the mapping out and the creation of mechanics in relation to data. Essentially, what you end up doing is you are creating a set of rules that will govern how a game will work, and most importantly, ensure that those rules provide the experience that you're hoping to deliver to the player. In relation to systems design as well, when you say in relation to data, it means your content. It means what you're providing, not just the rules, but levels, anything else, the narrative, whatever else gets parted or is part and parcel of data. Now, balance is basically taking all of that data and how you set it up and ensuring that it's, again, catering to what you're hoping to achieve, but also making sure it doesn't screw you, your company, or your game over by just being out of whack, right? Finally, there's some caveats. I'm not going to be giving you exact solutions to anything, so if anyone's here kind of expecting like an exact solution to a very precise problem, it's probably not going to be very helpful. When talking about systems design, the thing you want to remember is that you're not really designing for a problem tomorrow or next month, but something that's going to last the test of time, something that is going to last however long you expect this game to run. And of course, this is all based off of personal experience. So we have half an hour, and let's get started here. So first of all, you want to define your system, right? So the first thing you want to be figuring out is what you're trying to deliver. These are action words, these are experiences, these are basically your design pillars. All of these design pillars that you're going to be defining, they're assumptions, essentially. And this wraps around to the fact that there are no right answers. There are no, this is definitively what you want, or what has to be done, rather, but only what you want to be achieving. And this then leads into how you actually build this. So when you're defining your action words, you're basically also setting up your goals, defining what you're hoping to achieve. When you're doing this, you want to be precise, and you want to be very brief. Nobody wants to see a paragraph-long explanation of the experience you're trying to provide with your fun little MMORPG, right? Now, once you have a bunch of your action words set up, you want to set priorities between them. You can't just say, oh, there are these 5 things and only these 5 things. You define the priorities, what comes first, or what is prioritized before something else, and so on, all in relation to each other. And what I personally do after this is then I start creating a flow or a map that tells me how one action will lead into another, And again, be precise. Don't try and get into the micro functioning of your game for every little bit, right? When you're creating all of this, you'll start to understand how your game ticks. If I equip an item, that affects these stats. These stats affect this system. This system affects how the game, the gamer is going to play, what movement he has, and how that relates to everything else. These are the levers that you're going to understand and you want to be very cognizant of. It's also going to allow you to then tell yourself that these are the variables I'm going to allow in my system that allow me to affect different parts of the game. Once you have all that, you want to start reducing this down, which is where the reductionist aspect comes in. You take all the variables and you start to basically curate it. You figure out what you really want, what's really important to your game, or to the fact that you will be balancing this later on. You can't just straight up and say, I want a variable that tells me, yeah, you can set up multiple variables that say, I want one that adjusts movement speed, but also how quickly the player can rotate, and maybe a few other things related to movement. If by any chance you think that individually those are valuable to the game and they need to be governed separately, great. If somehow this is just a game that doesn't really matter, or where movement isn't your main focus, then having all of this combined into a single stat, or having them a single stat that calculates the others, makes more sense. So that's where you need to then start understanding what variables will matter. So as a use case, from the game I'm currently working on, is we were trying to create a scoring logic, right? So first I started with my design pillars. We are making a mix of a casual brawler and a light sim, and we've already defined the fact that the casual brawler takes precedent. We always wanted to be able to reward skilled gameplay. So with those design pillars in mind, I then moved to what my requirements were, which was a scoring system, and again, making sure that when the player's skill in this brawler matters. So that directly means how well your combos are played out, how many combos you get, and how large of a combo series you can achieve as well. Now, because I know how the game functions and I know what the loops are, I also can then define assumptions and constraints for myself. So the first constraint being the core stats that get improved should only be between 1 to 10 in value. Now, I gave this constraint simply because I knew that when you finish a brawling round, you would get a stat boost to one of your meta stats. And those would be somewhere between 5 to 20. So obviously, you don't want to be giving out more as a bonus than your core value. So hence the 1 to 10 requirement. For other stats that I will get into later, those values could vary, but the core stats did have to lie between 1 and 10. So I took all this information that I had and began implementing, and I came up with a system that was essentially, at least in text, was 2-point. One was to calculate for my cumulative combos as a score, then take that value and then convert it into a defined bonus. I will get back to this and how I did it precisely in just a moment. Oh wait, no, not just a moment. So this is basically what I did. I created an Excel, and the first thing I did, it's a two-factor setup. So what I did first is I defined what my combos would be. I set up a min and max requirement of concurrent hits for each combo set. And then I defined what the scoring would be. This is basically an exponential progression with a variable I can set outside that just says, this is my starting set, and a variable will define just how much it increases with every iteration. Now, in this, all I had to do was enter values here, which the video was for. So I'd enter values, and it would tell me what the score for each would be. That's simple multiplication. And the total score would basically be derived based off the sum of everything here. This would then move to the second part of this formula, where I would take that total score, and I could then say, these are all the possible payouts that I could have as rewards from the end of a brawl. And I just had to set something to true, and it would calculate what the value of that would be. This would change, of course, if I change the modifier. So as an example, if let's say my total score was roughly 2.5K, my payout for, let's say, just the mechanics value would be +7. If I change this to, let's say, 1.2, it would jump up to like 9-ish. Later on, we'll try and see if we can get these running, because it's kind of weird to do it without the explanation. Or actually, wait. Can you try clicking on this? Nothing? Okay. This does tell you, however, that a lot of game systems are basically just math. Most of what you do in games is math with pretty graphics, with the caveat being mostly. You also realize at this point that a lot of how you're going to be setting up a system, especially stuff that is scoring, scaling based, is leading straight into your balance. And this is where it's good to point out that, especially for starters out here or younger designers, it's really good to know your graphs. And it's then good to be able to understand that, or have the skill to draw the graph that you want to mimic the experience, and then find the function that'll work for that. So this is a fun little GIF that I like to use to help me out once in a while. So when I start working with logic, it's generally preferable to work in steps. So what I do first is I write down my logic. Like I did earlier, I write it down in text form, just a series of statements that I want to do this, and then this, and then this. And then I begin to, little by little, take that and convert it into a full-fledged formula and iterate on that process. An example of the same thing that from the Excel was, first I defined what I wanted to do, which, as I said, was to reduce the total achieved score to single digits. I then wanted to multiply that by a multiplier or a modifier based off of what type of stat it was. And then I made the decision that I wanted to then further divide that by the number of rewards, simply because I wanted all those payouts, or the score, to be equally divided amongst the payouts and not something that was given equivalently to whatever payouts were given. More as a version of balance on the off chance that in the future we decided to give multiple rewards instead of just one. If it's just one, it doesn't matter. It's basically a redundant part of the formula. But for the future, if we decide otherwise, this works out in our favor and we don't have to change up any code or change up any of our Excels. So then I expanded this into a formula. I would basically take the total score, divided by a divisor, and then by a constant of 100. The divisor was basically me adding a variable saying, I want this variable to be able to define how much I want this value to be reduced. If at any point I realize that our payouts are too high, I could reduce it, or if it's too low, I could increase it. And the 100 constant is just to get everything into single and double digits to kind of condense everything down. That's all. And the rest is pretty self-explanatory, into a multiplier and into the and divide by the count of rewards. Down here is, if anybody's interested in Excel, basically how I implemented in Excel. I've kind of screwed up here, and I kind of did that just so I could point out that when you're using singular cells, it's best to it's good process to kind of put in a variable name instead of just using a $sign to fix a particular point in Excel. That's about it. So this is a little image of what we are working on. So I'll let you kind of marvel at that while I get some water. So this is one of our backgrounds. Now, when it comes to balance, one thing that I like to do personally is to remember the rule of ratios. So especially when you have a heavy econ-based system, you want to be able to define all the items or all the interactable stats that a player will have in the game, and then create a table that basically defines all the ratios. Again, I don't think this video is playing. There's no way you can click on this either. Okay. Well, the idea is that you set up your ratios, and then the idea was that this part of the slide would kind of just be a video that would show you that whenever I changed energy, I would see each of the currencies changing accordingly. And this would allow you to keep a tab of how one stat related to another, to know whether you were giving out something that was too expensive or too cheap, or was kind of skewed in the favor of the developer or in the favor of the player. Now you can take this and expand upon it by adding a growth stat, and this would allow you again to grow or depreciate the value of a certain item as more iterations of it were used. Again, we're missing video, otherwise what you would see here is me changing the value of energy, and over time, at least with this much, you can see that with 15 energy, Without growth, you're just getting 1.5K currency 1. But because there is a growth stat on currency 1 of 1.2, with that growth, it's much higher. However, currency 2 depreciates, and you notice that there as well. So you can use this in multiple ways. It doesn't always have to be economy-based. If you're doing an RPG, you can set up a relationship of armor types versus weapon types, and kind of create a sort of relationship chart, and then base all your calculations off of that. And again, with Excel, you'd be able to quickly map out whether something was broken or not before you implemented it. Another use case was this, and again, this was more for a card game. And again, we're missing video, so it's going to be a little bit harder to explain. But I've already pre-created a correlation between 3 made-up stats called initiative, cooperation, and health. And there's a 4th, which is about a favored position. So as I changed the values here, you would see their essential power rating of each card change. And this could allow you to then balance. And what you could look at is, okay, right now, let's say Mary is at 32 points. So clearly, something there is way overpowered. And you could make an individual change to him. However, at any point, if you realize that, let's say, the cooperation stat was just weighted too high, which it is here, you could then go just straight up to the ratio and make a change there. And that cascades down and affects everything within your calculation. So you have 2 points of referencing things. And I think that's about it for me. Final thoughts. Be precise. Always write down your logic. And then iterate on that. There's no such thing as a perfect system. It's always something that will be built over time. It's not a sort of holy grail that you just get and it works. The other thing is that when you're balancing, there's no such thing, again, as, oh, this is balanced perfectly, unless you define what that means to you and your team or studio or game. Unless you define that, balance can be subjective, and it's based off of whatever someone says. So if you don't define what your goals are, you won't be able to measure through data collection how close to that you are. And yeah, this is just a quick look at what we're working on at Kaijo. And subject to change, obviously, because we've only been at it for about a month. Yeah, that's it. I can take questions now. Multiplayer bans. In regards to what?
Let's say asymmetric multiplayer.
Okay. Again, like, what do you want to know specifically about that balance? Like, how to approach it, or again, because generally, I'm going to assume it's an RTS because that's what I've worked on, unless you have something else in mind. But the thing to know is that more often than not, your core stats are going to stay the same, right? Just on a simple example, let's say time to spawn or time to spawn, resources cost, their health, defense, attack, all that. Those are not asymmetric, right? So those are your basic focal points. The idea to where I talk about reductionism is to always come down to a focal point of what is the commonality between things. So again, if you're using a rule of ratios, you can then create a ratio between just the core stats. And then when you're defining different units, you can then say, okay, this guy has a rough power rating of, let's say, 50, and the other one has 52. But then you come into the issue of utility, where utility can change. Some things are a little bit beyond just a number. So then you have to kind of apply your design side to it.
But I mean, how would you approach something without, I mean, the data that the players generate or something like that? I mean,
Well,
how much can you conceptualize before you send it into the beta?
all of it. Like, that's kind of what you have to do as a designer.
Yeah, but it doesn't, I mean, after the beta, it might not work out.
It may not. And that's what I'm saying, is that when talking about balance, you need to know what you're trying to achieve. So if you don't define that, and you're just like, let's say I've released a asymmetric game, and I'm like, I want there to be a win rate of exactly 50%, right, between either race. That's what you're defining. Then you can look at the data and see if that's true or not, and then you can then make adjustments accordingly. If you just go out and don't define that that's what your metric is going to be, and you just say, I want this to be balanced, then you're looking at forums and random bits of data, and it's just a lot of noise. You don't know what to pay attention to. I hope that helps.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah, so I just wanted to ask, so you're quantifying everything on a ratio basis, right? So for the initial base stats, when you have to define, say for a character, you want to define its damage, hit points, stuff like that. So is it on gut basis, or is it something that you still kind of have to figure out logically?
A little bit of both. So for a singular character, what I usually do is I still have a calculation that says, okay, if I've set the health to X, then these are what the other values should ideally be, and then you kind of twist them either in different directions to get a certain behavior. So if you're creating, let's say, a sniper, obviously you're dunking the health, but then putting that same amount of power into, let's say, its attack or its movement, or even into something that's utility-based, which is its ability to maybe cloak or something similar.
Okay, and another question, like, is it necessary to have a ratio basis on this, or like just have like definite values assigned, which is the singular quantifying value, but it's just defined without
for
any
me,
ratio?
ratios work. I do have a single quantifying value, which what I generally sometimes call a PowerPoint, no pun intended. But I then use that to define, okay, 5 health is equal to 1 power, and so on. It's very similar to what they do in card games, and that's kind of where I pull this in. So,
Cool, thanks.
no worries.
Hey, so you said that skill, the game you're making, the brawler one. So skill is equal to rewards, right?
Yeah.
The more you're skilled, the
or
more
bonus rewards.
bonus rewards. So what if like not everyone is skilled at brawler game, right? And then how do you define that for a specific person, this is the balance of the game, or one with not much skill, this is the balance? Do you define that as well?
Well, that's why I said that I knew that as a baseline, I'm still giving out a baseline reward, right? Which is anywhere currently between 5 to 20. And that's why I wanted to make sure that the bonus did not exceed that value.
Okay.
Yeah, so I just wanted to ask, are there good and bad scenarios for introducing randomness into your balance, like a probability-based variable or something like
That's a
that?
damn good question. That's like a whole talk right there. I guess there are. Like, it really depends on what you're trying to deliver. So one things I was working on, just with my friends, is a random combat mechanic just for tabletop. And we run into this same question where it's like, how much should a die value matter? And again, it depends on the experience. If you're looking for something that increases a certain amount of trepidation or a sense of an unknown, it works. And this is just in broad sense. But if you're working for something that is where you want people to make very informed decisions, then you want to move away from that. That's the best I can give you at the time being.
That works, thank you.
Right.
One last burning question. Anyone? Tejas?
Yeah. Yeah.
I actually had the same question, but I have now another question. Like, what happens when actually things go wrong? So things are unbalanced. Now, yeah.
So how do you approach something when you realize that something is massively unbalanced?
Yeah.
Okay, so there are different ways. Because you've defined where the levers are, right? As a designer, you then know that, okay, this one thing isn't working, and these are the 4 possible areas that could be basically screwing this up. So if you've done your job right, you've defined variables for each. To go to the card example, if let's say I realized that one whole stat was just overvalued, massively overvalued, I could dunk its ratio. If I realized that just one individual card was massively overpowered, I could then look at just the individual card and change its values, right? So the idea is not to is to build that system in such a way where you have the options to go in and say, I will make an adjustment here, I will make an adjustment there. And that will bring things back in line. And this is also where you iterate. And sure, there could be situations where whatever algorithm you've set up is just like completely messed up. You have to refactor it. You have to set it up again. Take some shit from your tech team because he has to redo it as well, and figure it out. But at that point, you just kind of swallow your pride and go forward.